Title: German officers complained about POW camp conditions. Patton showed them Dachau. Script: May 1945, occupied Germany. A few miles north of Augsburg, the spring sun warms the barbed wire of a new American prisoner of war camp. Inside the perimeter, the fighting is over. It is quiet. Thousands of regular soldiers sit in the dirt and wait for what comes next. But in the officers' wing, the silence breaks. 200 German majors and colonels stand in a neat, stiff line. They do not look like defeated men. They look like offended guests. They hold formal written petitions in their hands. One colonel steps forward. He demands hot showers. He demands German cooks to prepare his rations. He formally cites the Geneva Convention because his bed is too narrow. He believes the Americans have forgotten his rank. He is wrong. General George S. Patton is on his way. And Patton is bringing a lesson in reality that will change these men forever. This is the story of 200 German officers who complained about their comfort while their victims lay in mass graves, and the general who forced them to see the truth. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe to the channel. We tell the World War II stories that show the moments that forced people to face what they'd done. By joining us, you help keep these vital historical lessons alive. Lieutenant Daniel Pierce was 26 years old. He came from the gray, industrial smoke of Akron, Ohio. Before the war, he worked a steady shift at the Goodyear rubber plant, saving money for a small house he had not yet bought. He enlisted the day after his older brother's name appeared on a casualty list from the Hurtgen Forest. Pierce had fought through the mud and the mines of the Rhineland with the 12th Armored Division. He carried a heavy silence with him. His uniform was stained with grease, salt, and the dust of 3 countries. He was bone-tired. He wanted to go home to his mother and marry the girl who wrote him every Tuesday. Instead, he was assigned to the administrative office of the Augsburg camp. On this morning, he sat at a wooden field desk with a stack of papers that made his hands shake. He was the man tasked with reading the formal grievances of the officers who had fought for the regime that killed his brother. Standing across from the desk was Colonel Friedrich von Zeller. He was 51 years old and hailed from the ancient military families of Potsdam. Von Zeller wore a tunic that had been tailored in Berlin just weeks before the Reich collapsed. It was perfectly pressed. He kept his silver hair trimmed to a sharp, aristocratic edge. On his right hand, he wore a heavy gold signet ring engraved with a family crest that had survived 4 centuries of European war. He did not see himself as a defeated prisoner of a criminal state. He saw himself as a professional peer of the Americans who happened to be on the wrong side of a supply line. Von Zeller believed that the Geneva Convention was a shield for men of his station. He frequently told the camp guards that a man's worth was determined by the quality of his quarters and the deference shown to his rank. To him, the American camp was a breach of social order. May 1945 was a month of total collapse. The Third Reich was a memory, but its ghost remained in the minds of its leaders. Millions of German soldiers were surrendering to the Western Allies every week. The logistical weight of this victory was staggering. Every road in Germany was a river of refugees, liberated slave laborers, and defeated men. Food was a weapon of survival, and the American supply lines were stretched thin. Every loaf of bread and every gallon of fuel had to be accounted for in a landscape of ruins. In the chaos of the occupation, many American camp commanders looked for the easiest way to maintain order. They allowed the German military hierarchy to remain intact behind the barbed wire. It was a pragmatic choice that backfired. It created a bubble of unreality. Inside these camps, the old Prussian arrogance did not die. It festered. These officers had not yet seen the fire-gutted skeletons of their cities or the mass graves in the woods. They only saw that their coffee was lukewarm and their quarters were crowded. They believed that as professional soldiers, they were entitled to the comforts of their station, regardless of the crimes committed by their government. They drafted letters of protest on fine paper they had somehow salvaged. They cited international law to men who had just seen the liberation of the death camps. Many American officers let it slide, preferring a quiet camp to a confrontation. They accepted the complaints and filed them away, hoping the problem would vanish with time. But the pile of petitions grew until it could no longer be ignored. The delusion of the Wehrmacht officer corps was about to meet the hard edge of American justice. The quiet morning in the Augsburg office was the last moment of peace these 200 men would know. Pierce sat at the scarred wooden desk and looked at the stack of papers. The ink was elegant. The handwriting was perfect. Colonel von Zeller stood at attention, his eyes fixed on the far wall. "I have reviewed your petitions, Colonel," Pierce said. "And when will the adjustments be made?" von Zeller asked. "There will be no adjustments to the calorie count. I am a colonel of the Wehrmacht, and I expect my rank to be honored. You are a prisoner of war, and you are eating the same rations as my men. That is precisely the problem. I don't follow you. A man of my station requires sustenance that reflects his responsibilities. You have no responsibilities anymore, Colonel. I have the responsibility of maintaining the dignity of the German officer corps. Off." The petitions mention the bedding. "The cots are narrow and the blankets are coarse. They are the same blankets I sleep under. Perhaps your people are accustomed to such things. My people are accustomed to winning wars." "Winning a war does not exempt you from the Geneva Convention. Which article are you citing?" "The one regarding the maintenance of honor and the standard of living for officers. We are short on fuel and food for the entire province. That is an American administrative failure, not a German one. You also requested private showers with hot water. Hygiene is essential for the morale of my men. The survivors in the towns nearby haven't had hot water in 2 years. The civilian population is not my concern. You demanded German cooks for your mess hall. An officer should not have his food prepared by his enemies. You think you're too good for American cooking? I think we are entitled to our own customs. And the major who complained his portion was too small. He is a man of large stature and noble birth. He cannot subsist on crumbs. It is a full tray of food, Colonel. It is peasant food served in a peasant fashion. You truly believe this is a violation of your rights? I believe you are treating us like common criminals. I will pass this up the chain. See that you do, Lieutenant." Pierce stood up and gathered the papers. He walked into the next office and handed the folder to Colonel Walter Reeves. Reeves was 39, from Pittsburgh, and he had seen enough of the war to have no patience left for aristocratic posturing. He read the top 3 complaints and reached for the telephone. The report reached Patton within the hour. The siren at the main gate cut through the thick afternoon heat. A single open-top jeep roared into the compound, kicking up a cloud of gray grit. General Patton stepped out before the wheels stopped turning. His boots were polished to a mirror shine. 4 silver stars flashed on his helmet. The ivory-handled revolvers hung on his hips. He did not look at the guards. He looked at the 200 men in their clean tunics. The camp became a vacuum of sound. Patton walked to the front of the formation and stopped in front of Colonel von Zeller. He tapped the folder of petitions against his thigh. "Did you write these grievances, Colonel?" Patton asked. "I did, General," von Zeller said. "You believe your rations are too small for a man of your birth? A major requires more than a private to maintain his strength, and the lack of hot water is a violation of your honor? It is a basic requirement for a civilized officer corps. You feel the American Army has failed to provide the comfort you deserve? We expected the treatment promised by international law." Patton stood inches from the colonel's face. He spoke with a quiet, terrifying clarity. "You stand here in a tailored coat and talk to me of honor. You cite the Geneva Convention to cover your own arrogance. You complain that the bread is dry and the beds are narrow. You worry about the temperature of your bath while the soil of this country is soaked in the blood of the innocent. I have spent the morning at Dachau. In those barracks, the beds were not narrow. They were wooden shelves stacked 5 high. The men in them did not complain about the bread. They died for the lack of it. They did not ask for hot showers. They were marched into rooms labeled as showers and gassed to death by your orders. Lieutenant Pierce here has seen his friends blown to pieces by your guns. He eats the same food you call filth. He works 18 hours a day to keep you alive. You are a member of a gang that turned murder into a government department. You have 2 options. You will retract every word in this folder right now, or you will board the trucks waiting at the gate. I am going to show you the civilization you served. You will look at the ash. You will smell the ovens. Then you will tell me again about your cold coffee. Decide now." Von Zeller looked at the trucks. He looked at Patton's eyes. He remained silent. He turned and climbed into the back of the first truck. The convoy of 10 trucks rumbled out of the gates and headed east toward Dachau. Under the watchful eyes of American guards with loaded garons, the 200 officers sat in rigid silence. When the tailgates dropped at the camp entrance, the air hit them first. It was a heavy, sweet rot that no breeze could clear. Patton ordered them marched through the gates. They walked past the rows of narrow wooden barracks where the living skeletons still lay. They were forced into the punishment cells where men had been chained to walls. They stood in the medical experiment rooms where the floors were still stained with chemicals and blood. Finally, they were led to the crematoria. The bricks of the ovens were still warm to the touch. A group of survivors, hollow-eyed and dressed in striped rags, stood by the chimneys. One survivor stepped forward and pointed a trembling finger at a major in the middle of the group, identifying a face from a labor detail. No one spoke. The German officers looked at the stacks of ash and then at their own polished boots. When the trucks returned to Augsburg that evening, the complaining stopped. At dinner, the officers did not mention the portions. Instead, they folded their bread in napkins and tucked it deep into their pockets. Daniel Pierce returned to Akron in the winter of 1945. He married Sarah, the girl from the letters, and they raised 3 children in a small house near the rubber plant. He went back to his shift at Goodyear and worked there for 35 years. He was a quiet man. He never joined the veteran groups, and he never hung his medals on the wall. But his children noticed that he never left a single crumb of bread on his plate. He taught them that food was a gift, not a right. He died in 1994 at the age of 75. He was buried in a simple grave, carrying the memory of that afternoon in the German dust to his final rest. Friedrich von Zeller never saw his family estate in Potsdam again. It was seized and leveled by the Soviets before the year was out. He served 3 years in a denazification camp, performing the manual labor he once thought was beneath him. He spent his final years in a cramped apartment in Munich. The gold signet ring was sold to a jeweler for bread and coal in 1948. He lived in silence, a relic of a collapsed world. He died in 1968. No officers attended his funeral. Patton kept the folder of retracted complaints in his field desk. He mentioned the day only once in a letter to his wife. He wrote that the German officers had finally learned the difference between a grievance and a tragedy. He said that some men require the smell of the furnace to remind them they are lucky to be breathing. Some historians argue that Patton's decision was an unnecessary piece of theater that skirted the standard protocols of military administration. They contend that as a commanding officer, his role was to manage the camp according to established regulations rather than staging emotional confrontations. Others argue that this direct exposure was a vital component of the denazification process. They believe that only a physical, undeniable encounter with the regime's atrocities could break the institutional arrogance of the German leadership. What is certain is that the formal grievances from the Augsburg camp vanished overnight. The officers who had once demanded luxury spent the rest of the war cherishing every scrap of rationed bread. If you had been in Patton's position, would you have done the same? Or would you have simply ignored their petitions and let the hunger do the talking? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories about the moments that forced people to face what they'd done, make sure to subscribe.